Well, a very warm welcome to the launch of the 2018 Legatum Prosperity Index. We're absolutely thrilled you could all be here with us this evening. On your chair, you should have found a copy of this year's Prosperity Index. This is yours to keep. Please feel very free to take it with you. Read it, learn it, memorize it if you would like to. Please take that. That's a gift from us. If you would like to delve deeper into the Prosperity Index, please visit prosperity.com, which is the website where all of the data, findings, analysis from this year's Prosperity Index is housed. And if you have any questions about the Prosperity Index, you can find Legatum Institute members of staff around the room this evening who will be glad to answer those for you. It is now my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Legatum Institute, Mr. Allan Mccormack.
Nathan, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. You're all looking very, very cozy tonight in here. Welcome, as Nathan has said, to the launch of the 2018 Prosperity Index. Lancaster House is a very special venue. It's home to a number of important agreements and speeches that have literally changed the course of this nation's history and, of course, many others as well. But it's also significant for those of you who like period dramas, because Lancaster House was, of course, the venue for the Christmas special of Downton Abbey, and was also used as Buckingham Palace in the Netflix series The Crown, for those of you who've seen it. At Legatum, we're passionate about the Prosperity Index because it frames all of our work and reflects our vision to see all people lifted out of poverty. The index is now in its 12th edition and has become the global standard for evaluating national progress, distinct from economic measures like GDP. The first edition covered only 60 countries, but now we have 149 countries, and we cover 99% of global GDP and 97% of the world's population. But the index itself had an interesting origin. It emerged from some conversations with myself and my business partners, Christopher, Mark, and Philip, who are here tonight. And we are business people. We've been investing in private companies and publicly listed companies now for many years. And over that time, we observed the disparity between countries. And we started asking ourselves the questions, why were some countries more successful than others? Indeed, we're driven by a deeper purpose as partners, and we like to apply our time and resources to tackle some of the biggest challenges that we can see in our generation, which range from things like abolishing slavery to reducing diseases and to giving children who've fallen out of school a second chance around the world. But as I say, our formation has been in business, and particularly international business. And we saw these disparities, and we started to ask ourselves some questions, such as what drives national success? Why do some countries progress whilst others seem to be left behind? Why is it that talent is evenly distributed around the world, but of course opportunity is not? And what's the transmission mechanism that enables countries to pass on prosperity from one generation to the next? In answering these questions, we wondered whether answers could be reduced to a recipe that could be understood and replicated for use by individuals and communities and at the national level as well. Existing metrics at the time were inadequate for defining the broad sense of prosperity and holistic understanding of prosperity that we had. And it was Robert Kennedy who pointed out the inadequacies of GNP 50 years ago when he said this: gross national product counts our air pollution and our cigarette advertising, and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither the wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell you everything about America except why we are proud to be Americans. And the same could perhaps be said of our own country. The Prosperity Index is an attempt to answer Kennedy's challenge, bringing together both wealth and well-being and capturing some of these answers and explaining what it is that makes life worthwhile. Now I'm going to hand over to Philippa, but before she comes to the stage, we have a short video which will tell you the story of global prosperity in 2018. So welcome and thank you for being here once again.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a huge privilege to welcome each and every one of you to the launch of the 12th Legatum Prosperity Index. As a team, we have been hugely looking forward to this evening and to sharing with you the findings of our index. And we particularly wanted to shine a spotlight on what creates the pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations. We believe that there are two fundamental components to prosperity. First, economic well-being, and second, social well-being. And these two are not independent of one another. Rather, true prosperity is the result of them working hand in hand together. As you can imagine from an index like you have on your seat, there are literally hundreds of lessons that we could have drawn out of this year's index. But this evening, we're going to focus on just a few, because otherwise we would literally have you here all evening. So the first lesson and emerging finding from the index that we want to share is that global prosperity is rising and is at its highest level ever. And I've literally just come from doing the BBC World programme, and I can tell you that every single news clip leading up to me presenting the Prosperity Index was telling a very, very different story. So global prosperity is rising, and 6 out of 7 regions in the world have improved their prosperity. Prosperity has risen in 113 countries out of 149. And more encouragingly than that is that 85% of the world's population lives in those countries. But also, as we've seen from the video, it is not all good news. As we have seen, our second finding is that whilst global prosperity has risen, the gap between those nations at the top of the index and those nations at the bottom of the index has widened. So as global prosperity has risen for many, for some, they are falling further behind. And more worryingly, our third finding is that safety and security is continuing to decline in 5 out of 7 regions of the world. And over the last 10 years, the numbers of deaths caused directly by war has increased by 60%, and deaths from terrorism have quadrupled. So it is clear that still, as a generation, we have some challenges ahead of us. But one of the lessons we have learnt from all of our work across the Legatum Institute is that prosperity grows and develops where leaders are making active and focused decisions to build and drive an agenda for change. And the Legatum Prosperity Index is a tool that we want to put in the hands of the leaders of politics, business, and society to guide them in that active decision-making, to build greater prosperity, and for those seeking as well, to hold them to account. So to explain this year's findings in a little bit more detail than I'm going to, I want to welcome Dr. Stephen Bryan to the stage, who's going to unpack the findings of the index for us. Stephen. Stephen, it's not like we don't normally talk to one another in our days. In order to drive prosperity in nations, as we have seen, we need a tool that's actually capable of capturing and measuring prosperity. Can you tell us how the Legatum Prosperity Index does that?
Sure. The aim is to try and find something that's holistic, some way of capturing the full gamut. Indeed, if we take Allan's comments of quoting Robert Kennedy, we can't quite manage to capture the quality of poetry, but nearly everything else on that list, there are ways of measuring. And I think, if we could measure the quality of poetry, I think we'd do our best to get it in there somehow or another. But we need something holistic. And what we have done is we have identified 9 different areas, what we call 9 pillars. And within those, we've got 104 indicators from 149 countries around the world. We believe that's a very good starting point to measure prosperity. Now, when we think about this, we look along these 9 pillars and we say to ourselves, let's take the first 2, which are predominantly economic in focus. How good is the business environment? Is it an environment in which companies can be easily formed and can they compete in the marketplace? A country like the United States, which is top in that pillar, sort of epitomizes that type of business environment. The next part is around the economic quality. So is the quality of the economic system that results from that sufficient to have plenty of full employment and a satisfactory standard of living? In that area, Singapore would be a good example of a country that has good economic quality as a result of its business environment. Then we look at some of the institutional structures. We're seeking inclusive societies where everybody can engage and feel part of the community. And at its base level, you mentioned safety and security. That's the first layer that we've got to get right. And again, a country that we're doing really well in that, say, would be Japan. It epitomizes a society where there's no battlefield deaths, there's low violence, relatively low crime, and people can feel secure in their daily lives. On the back of that, we need to see, do we have good governance? Can the government act effectively and efficiently? Can it be held to account? Is the rule of law upheld? The Netherlands would be a good example of a country like that. Next, personal freedom. Do people have the ability just to go about their daily lives in an unrestricted way? In 2 ways. One is, are there legal laws that prevent them? Is there an absence of press freedom, freedom of assembly, etc.? But also, particularly at the top end of the index, is there social tolerance that allows people to feel that they're free to do things? It's one thing saying there's no law against it, but if society doesn't allow you to do things, if society doesn't tolerate minorities and disadvantaged people, they're not functionally free. And a great example of that type of country that really does well in that would be, say, either in New Zealand or indeed in Norway from that point of view. And then finally, social capital. Again, this is where New Zealand is very good. Do you have the community bonds and the trust that allows people to engage, to trust each other? Because that's the foundation of being able to cooperate and engage in commerce. The last area we look at is around empowered people. How empowered are they to fulfill their dreams and their goals? So that means, are they well educated? Is there a good education system? And for the education aficionados out there, it'll be no surprise to hear that Finland is number 1 in that area. Also, is the population healthy? Are the health systems good? And here we see, for example, the rather devolved system of cantons and municipalities in Switzerland delivers very good healthcare. And then I would say the last layer is the environment, the natural environment. Again, Robert Kennedy mentioned this with respect to the redwoods. We want to make sure that the environment is free from pollution and that there are systems in place to sustain it well so it's existing for future generations. And say within Europe, Austria might be a good way of epitomizing that sense of having a good environment. So when we add all this together, we're able to generate a map of the world and rank and score countries for their prosperity. And that then enables people to hold the leaders to account, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So taken together, that gives us a really good understanding of kind of the economic and social well-being that we've been talking about. But global prosperity has actually risen this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned 113 countries going up over the last 5 years. But furthermore, if you look at longer-term perspective, say 10 years, what we see is that it's risen significantly, and it's the equivalent of every country having gone up 15 places in the index. So a mid-ranked country, say, for example, Mongolia, today enjoys a level of prosperity that a South Africa would have enjoyed, say, 10 years ago. And that represents how the entire world is lifted up. Now, of course, at the very top of this index, one country epitomizes not just fantastic prosperity, but also that continued rise, and that's Norway, which has, again, topped the index for another year. And it's done that through very good safety and security. In fact, it's even more safe and secure than Japan is. It's very strong social capital, very good governance. And what's more, it's continuing to improve in its education. Hasn't quite caught up with Finland yet, but it's on its way to doing so.
But we're seeing this divergence, so the countries at the top are getting greater prosperity and those at the bottom. And what kind of part is safety and security playing in that?
Quite an important part. Now, let me step back for a second and explain what we've been doing, because I think we've seen the aggregate drop in safety and security, and that's obviously a matter of concern. But we've also looked at the countries that have grown the most and the countries that have declined the most. And what we see when we look at those is that the countries that declined the most started with weak freedom, but then they declined in their safety and security. The countries that grew the most started with strong safety and security, and that continued. I think what we're seeing is that these declining countries, they had weak institutions. A lot of them, for example, Tunisia and Algeria, Sudan, a lot of them are in Africa and the Middle East. And what we're seeing is the weak institutions are not able to withstand shocks and other external threats to the system. Yeah. And that's something of big concern.
And that gap between the top and the bottom, those are extraordinary differences. And we know that it doesn't need to be that way. That's what the Prosperity Index shows us.
Yeah. So back to the Norway example.
Yeah.
Norway is the top of the index. Afghanistan at the bottom of the index this year, that gap, as you say, has widened. But to make it sort of more real, if you look at those two countries and think about the gap in prosperity in terms of human terms, if your children had been born in Afghanistan rather than Norway, they would have had a 20-year shorter lifespan. They'd have had only 1/3 the literacy as teenagers, and not to mention the vast gulf in economic quality that they'd have experienced. It's very real, this difference. And I think, back to your safety and security issue, Afghanistan is another classic example of a country that has lacked some of those basic foundations that need to be worked on.
So there's one interesting story coming out of the index as well, in terms of how closely it correlates with the lived experience of people, and that it's a better indicator of people's happiness. Can you talk to us about that, Steve?
Sure. I mean, to go back to the spirit of Allan's introduction, the reason we focus on prosperity is because we're keen to find that lived experience, understand what drives well-being in addition to simply wealth. And if we think about the world, it's sort of well known that countries that are richer or indeed more prosperous tend to be populated by happier people. But that could just simply be reflecting culture. So you can't look at that and say, hey, wealth or prosperity makes people happier. A truer test is to say that if wealth or prosperity rises, does well-being rise? And if it falls, does well-being fall over a period of time? Because that's saying we're holding things like geography, culture, etc., constant, and asking if really some of the fundamentals change, do we see people being more content? And this is where the data comes out very much in favor of prosperity. We took, again, they take the 20 countries, the 20 big risers that we looked at, and the 20 fallers. And you'll see on the left of this graph, we then mapped their well-being as reported, surveys year in, year out, across this time period. And what we saw was that the fallers in prosperity, their well-being of their people declined, whereas the risers, it rose. Starting to see, okay, there's a pattern here, there's a real relationship. Then we say, okay, well, look, but what about GDP? What we then need to do is to look at a different set of countries, some the same, some different, of the countries that rose the most in terms of GDP, and the countries that fell the most in terms of GDP, and said, what happened to their well-being? Did it move in the same way or not? And the results are quite interesting. Because when we look at that, we certainly see that when GDP falls or wealth is lost, people are less content. One level, no surprise. But what's really making the difference between wealth and prosperity is when we look at the GDP risers. These are the 20 countries who over the last 10 years have had the greatest increase in GDP per capita. Their well-being of their people has hardly changed. So simply adding to their wealth has not made a difference, whereas adding to prosperity does make a difference. And the reason we believe this is true is because we are capturing those broader issues around governance and social capital and freedom, issues around health and education that capture the rich gamut of people's lives, and we do believe really gets the essence of true prosperity and well-being.
Stephen Bryan, thank you very much for that whistle-stop tour of the Prosperity Index. Really
My
grateful.
pleasure.
Thank you. So, as you have heard from Stephen, the index is measuring economic and social well-being. As countries address their issues of safety and security, they're actually able to build their economies. As they're able to build their economies, they're able to invest in services such as education and health. And while the Prosperity Index is focused on the lives of millions of people, and as we've seen, on 149 countries around the world, at the Legatum Institute, we're also concerned about the life of the one, the life of the individual. One of our rising countries, Paraguay, demonstrates how investment in healthcare and education can significantly improve the outcomes for people living there. And we're going to tell this story through the life of one girl called Liz. So Paraguay is just one example of growing global prosperity. And obviously Liz is just one story from the story of Paraguay. And as we've heard, global prosperity is at its highest level ever. And China and India make up 40% of the increase in the last decade of that prosperity and have largely been responsible for lifting 2 billion people out of poverty over the last 40 years. So Oliver Letwin MP was Minister for Government Policy in David Cameron's government and leads our World Ahead programme, looking at the role of India and China in the 21st century. And it's my great privilege to welcome him to the stage to continue our story of the rise in global prosperity. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you, Philippa. The story of one individual is, of course, much more touching than any number of statistics, as we've seen in the film about Paraguay. But if one wants to reflect what is in this remarkable document and in its predecessors, one needs to think also about the mass. And as Philip has just said, a huge proportion of the entire population of the globe lives in just 2 countries of India and China. And it's extraordinarily fashionable in our country, perhaps particularly at the moment, but actually I think has been one of our hallmarks over many centuries, to be really remarkably pessimistic. We adore the ability to grumble, and we relish the idea that the good old days were the good old days, and things have been getting worse ever since. Therefore, it came as a terrible shock to me when I began to reflect on what has actually been happening to this troubled world of ours, so that we constantly read about in every media outlet, which when the historians look back on the period since the 1980s, has really one outstanding feature, which is very much reflected in this document, which is that those 2 vast countries that between them have more than a third of the world's population in them have by leaps and bounds transformed the scene. In China, absolute poverty has essentially been eliminated. There's a tiny, tiny bit of it left. In India, it's been halved. And this process is continuing. In this very document, each of those two countries has risen by 10 percentage points, not just in the GDP measures, but across a range of indicators that Stephen was describing. And of course, both of those countries face huge challenges of many kinds. But it is remarkable to reflect that for the first time in the last 3 centuries, China and India are catching up with the West. And this has not put the West at a disadvantage. On the contrary, as Philippa mentioned, the whole world has risen in prosperity and will continue to do so as China and India grow and improve their health, their education, their security, the lifestyles and the quality of life of their populations. So I'm terribly sorry to have to tell you that I think that the real message of this document is that we actually have grounds for optimism about the future of mankind. And if we can bear that reality, I think T.S. Eliot once said that human beings can only bear a very small amount of reality, but if we can bear that amount of reality, we might actually go home quite happy this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, for that, and for all the work that you are doing with us as well. We absolutely love it. So outside of Asia Pacific, the region, as we continue our tour of the world on global prosperity, the region that has shown the greatest rise in prosperity has been Eastern Europe. And much of its improvement has been led by the opening up of the old Soviet Union economies. And over the last decade, for example, this region has seen the biggest improvement in its business environment. And within this region, there is a country whose economy has grown even faster than that of China over the last 30 years. And that country is Estonia, whose GDP has grown by 800% since 1991. Its rise in prosperity more broadly has been driven by the clear and sustained choices of its leaders, choosing to adopt reforms that set it on the pathway from poverty to prosperity. Their reforms have unleashed the entrepreneurial spirit of the Estonians, leading it to be one of the most dynamic and innovative economies in Europe. And we're just going to watch a video that tells some of that story. So while Estonia is a great example of the fact that prosperity continues to rise around the world, it is concerning to us that the gap between those at the top of the index and those at the bottom of the index is widening. And this is driven in large part by falling safety and security. In particular, we have seen that many countries in the Middle East and in North Africa lack the institutional resilience to deal with deteriorating safety and security. And this year we found that, for example, despite the reduction in absolute global poverty rates, we estimate that 1/3 of the people around the world struggle to buy food at some point in the last year, compared to 1/4 10 years ago. And this lack of resilience is driving migration, whether it is people fleeing from economic insecurity in, say, somewhere like Venezuela, or from violence and conflict in somewhere like Syria. Olivia Hamill from Oxford Analytica partners with us at the Legatum Institute on our work on global migration and is going to come now to the stage to explain how declining safety and security in all its forms is driving people movement around the world. Olivia. Migration has risen to an all-time high, with 258 million people living outside the country of their birth, and that's up from 178 million in 2000. Can you just talk us through the scale of migration and what's kind of behind it?
Yeah, well, while the number of international migrants does continue to grow, as a proportion of the global population, it's actually remained fairly consistent over the years, around 3%, yeah, 3.4 currently. what has reached a record high is the number of refugees. So currently, 1 in every 10 international migrants is a refugee, a human being forcibly displaced by conflict, by persecution, and by violence.
And what can you tell us about safety and security as a driver of migration?
Well, beyond conflict per se, it's very difficult to single out a factor of displacement, of migration. What we see is that all factors are very deeply intertwined. So, for example, currently, insecurity combined with limited livelihood opportunities is driving thousands from Central America's Golden Triangle to the US. In the Horn of Africa, environmental degradation is worsening food insecurity, and that in turn is aggravating existing migratory flows due to conflict. So I think we can say that insecurity in its broadest sense is certainly the most powerful driver of migration. And if we look beyond the standard dichotomy between refugees on one hand and economic migrants on the other, so a much bigger number than 9 out of 10, we find that many people are compelled to leave their homes because they live in an insecure environment, and they don't qualify, obviously, for international protection.
Yeah. So in the UK, there's a lot of media attention focused on migration in Europe, but where is most of the people movement happening in the world?
Well, it's a very important point, because in 2015, 1.8 million 1.8 million irregular migrants reached the EU. So it's a huge number. But that was in 2015. In 2018, at least to the end of September, that number had dropped to 108,000. So it's a 94% drop. It's very significant. Most migration is actually intra-regional. 3 out of every 4 migrants, international migrants, so including opportunity, necessity-driven migrants and refugees, 3/4 of them stay within their regions. In fact, the lowest income countries host about 30% of the world's refugees, not international, just the refugees. And within the EU, Germany is the only country that's part of the top 10 refugee hosting countries globally, with approximately 800,000 migrants. That's equivalent to 1% of the population.
Those are really interesting numbers. One of the findings of our work, though, is that the journeys that migrants go on can be long and arduous. Can you take us through what a journey looks like for many migrants?
Well, with very limited options for legal migration, many migrants undertake irregular journeys. That means these journeys are obviously extremely dangerous. Not only that, irregular migrants accumulate debt, they're unprotected, and they have no legal recourse. It's also very important to note that journeys are not linear. So, for example, from southern Nigeria to Italy and increasingly Spain, the average length of the journey is about 3 years. That the migrant will make multiple stops to pay for the next leg of his journey. And importantly, at the onset of the journey, the final destination is not necessarily established. It's not necessarily decided. There's another example that I find very telling. In 2016 and 2017, there was a major spike in Bangladeshi irregular arrivals in the EU. And it emerged that these migrants were not coming directly from Bangladesh. They were coming from Libya, where many had been established for years, even decades, working in the oil industry. And after 2011 and the deterioration of the security situation, they were forced to leave and moved forward.
And are these journeys similar across the world, or do they vary by region?
They vary hugely by region, even by sub-region, and there are multiple factors that shape them, not least the wealth of the individual at the onset of the journey. But there are some common traits across irregular migrant journeys. One is the risk of exploitation and the increasingly blurred boundaries between people smugglers, who are facilitators, although illegal, but that's sort of their role, and human trafficking groups and networks, so more criminal organizations. What we find is that these exploitation can obviously take multiple forms. The journey from sub-Saharan Africa, or specifically from West Africa or East Africa to the EU, those are the journeys that are most reliant on smuggling networks. And I'm sure everybody here has seen or heard of the conditions of migrants in Libya who have been tortured, kidnapped, held in detention centers, some official, some not, and some have been sold as slaves. A completely different form of exploitation would be an example from Asia, an intra-regional migration example, where a Bangladeshi migrant pays an agent to get a labor visa to go to Malaysia, and upon arrival realizes that it's not quite a work visa, it's a student visa that's associated with a fake university, so to speak. It's a scam, essentially. And so that migrant is effectively stranded in Malaysia, unable to work, and certainly more vulnerable to exploitation than ever.
Olivia Hamill, we love working with you at the Legatum Institute, and we are convinced that this issue of people movement is one of the biggest humanitarian challenges of our generation, and thank you so much for sharing a snippet with us of it tonight. Thank you very much. So by improving safety and security, we would have the opportunity to address those issues of forced migration that Olivia has just been unpacking for us. And there is hope. One country that has gone against the downward trend of safety and security is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka ended its near 3-decade civil war in 2009 and has since seen rising prosperity, and we are still holding our breath as we went to print on our index that would remain the case. So we will be seeing a video about a woman called Vasuki, which demonstrates how when a nation addresses its issues of safety and security, its people begin to prosper. So although the video we've just watched has highlighted the life experiences of Vasuki and her determination to rebuild her life, we know that the context for her prosperity was also made possible by leaders. And at the Legatum Institute, we are interested in what enables leaders to develop. In particular, we want to know what decisions leaders make to ensure that their nations go on that journey from poverty to prosperity. And we have been examining countries that have moved from poverty to prosperity, and there are a few recurring themes. One of those recurring themes is that countries that have gone on that pathway have taken responsibility for their own development. They haven't waited until somebody else has come to help them do it. They've actually said, no, we are taking responsibility for our own development. The second is that where they have received external support or help, either in skills, in investment, or in aid, they've used it for their own determined priorities, not for anybody else's priorities, but for their own decided priorities. And to illustrate this, I would like to invite to the stage Her Excellency the High Commissioner of Rwanda to talk about the differences that leadership have made and that she has seen make across the African Union. Yamina, welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, Philippa. I'm pleased to be here, and although I'll focus on Africa, let me start with telling you the story of Rwanda, a country many of you only heard of in '94, when 1 million of our citizens were slaughtered in just 100 days. As the world watched, some hoping it was a nightmare, and unfortunately it wasn't. The dead were counted, buried, and Rwandans had to wake up to a new reality. The killings had stopped, but what was next? When we speak of the genocide against the Tutsi, we rightly focus on the 1 million+ lost lives, but the damage was much more pronounced. The economy had shrunk by 50%, 64% inflation, a 78% poverty rate, and of course, an overwhelming number of displaced persons. The entire socioeconomic fabric was destroyed and the infrastructure was dilapidated. So a complete restart was required. And we also had huge capacity gaps with no institutional framework. The war was over, the genocide had stopped, but we needed a recipe for peace. So a series of development strategies were started, with Vision 2020 being implemented in 3 stages. First, recovery from post-conflict. Second, preparation for takeoff. And third, a focus on rapid growth and fast poverty reduction. In Rwanda, the recipe for peace was, as a nation, we made a pact to stay together, to think big, and to be accountable to one another. Those achievements were mainly driven by homegrown solutions and innovations that were drawn from our own culture, the Rwandan culture. We looked inward and adopted the kind of changes that our citizens would naturally embrace. We worked to achieve economic and social transformation using transformational governance, which focused on promoting Rwandan values, as I said, promoting unity and reconciliation, contribution to peace and security at the global stage, fighting corruption, and increasing the tax base through private sector federation and foreign direct investment. We have now graduated from 90% dependence on foreign aid to about 16% today. And so the principle of self-reliance is one that guided us. The reason we've managed to move a bit faster from conflict to prosperity is through a visionary and courageous leadership. Yes, it takes courage to carry the vision towards its implementation, taking local context into consideration, and arguing with development partners when whatever they proposed was not adequate. To borrow the words of Dr. Donald Kaberuka at the launch of the LSE Oxford Commission on State Fragility, which he co-chaired with Right Honorable David Cameron, he says, escaping fragility is, by necessity, a slow, step-by-step, and often imperfect process. International support will be needed, but the chances of success are higher if the country and its people are in the driver's seat. The first step is security, which requires a large degree of locally led rebuilding of trust. Escaping fragility is not always about money. Top-down, donor-led approaches with unrealistic, tight timetables have not produced enduring results. Early efforts will be needed to revive the local private sector, which is often the lifeline for families and communities when the state can no longer assure its basic core functions. Confidence generated by domestic businesses is what will spur foreign investment, not vice versa. I would only add to these very wise words that when we discuss ending poverty, we must touch on the issue beyond a given nation's control, which perpetuate poverty as well. I was reminded yesterday that Africa can export tomatoes, but not tomato paste to Europe, and a host of other non-processed goods, coffee, cocoa, and many others. And so even with the best leadership that is working very hard at delivering tremendous progress, we must admit that the global community must act with intent to support sustainable growth, the kind which reduces balance of payments. Oftentimes, we find ourselves entangled into an unforgiving web of complex economic pacts favoring those who already have an economic advantage and punishing the ones hoping to improve their manufacturing industries and adding value to their exports. Let me end by saying that one clear avenue to start seriously addressing the unequal arrangements I just touched on is by consolidating reforms being implemented at the Africa Union level. Reforms which will produce an AU fit for purpose, serving the interests of the 1.2 billion Africans with a combined GDP of more than 3 trillion pounds, and starting with the Africa Free Trade Area, enhancing movement of goods and services within the continent. An efficient AU is not only good for Africa, but equally good for this global village that we all share. President Paul Kagame, who chairs the reform team, will continue focusing on this important value proposition, which, if well implemented, could redefine Africa's standing in the world and again offering better solutions to the crises on the continent, such as the migration crisis we heard of earlier. Thank you.
At the Legatum Institute, we have just loved getting to know you, Yamina, so thank you so much for sharing that with us. And for that look at courageous leadership that can transform a nation as well. It's so important to remember that the journey from poverty to prosperity is only possible when leaders have the best interests of their own countries at heart. So in conclusion, I am not going to keep you from your wine and canapes for very much longer. So in conclusion, the good news from this year's Prosperity Index is that global prosperity has risen and is at its highest level ever. However, the gap between those at the top and those at the bottom has widened. And we are concerned about the levels of deterioration of safety and security, which is such a fundamental building block for prosperity. And as we have just heard, good leadership is critical to nations building their own pathway from poverty to prosperity, and for enabling individuals like Liz and Vasuki and companies like Guardtime to thrive. This year's index provides many, many reasons for optimism. It illustrates how prosperity is evolving across the world and shows how individuals, communities, and nations can go on that pathway. We know that so many of you in this room share the same heart and the same passion as we do to see all people prosper. We know that you are partnering in this task by the businesses that you are leading, by the support that you are providing to individuals one at a time, and for the leadership that you are showing. And we're just looking forward to this ongoing conversation between this extraordinary community of people as we seek to create firmer and stronger pathways from poverty to prosperity. Thank you all for joining us, and come and join us downstairs for drinks and canapes. Thank you.